As you know, the session is about championing young learners on their learning journey. And I will focus on a number of things that hopefully will assist you in doing that. And we will be talking in particular about five things to know about developing thinking skills in ELT. All right, so let's have a look at the content that I'm hoping to cover in this session. I will first of all talk about why we should actually develop thinking skills in children. We'll be looking at cognitive control functions or executive brain functions. And another important area in developing thinking skills, and that is children's life competencies. And then for the main part of the webinar, we'll be looking at the implementation of these theoretical concepts in our teaching. So we'll be looking at a concept of using cognitive challenge as an ongoing teaching and learning principle. So let's have a look at the first question here. Why should we develop thinking skills, and what does research actually say about this? There's been a fascinating range of studies into the development of cognitive skills over the last few years, and a number of people are actually talking about the new science of learning. So let me briefly summarize what the recent research actually says here. Well, not surprisingly, one of the most important objectives that we want to achieve when working with young learners is increasing their ownership, not only of the language they're learning, but also their ownership of the learning process. So help them to become the managers, we could say, of their own learning process. So we're talking about self-regulated learning here. And recent research clearly shows that self-regulated learning, as much as the development of thinking skills and learning to learn, are parts of improving our students' metacognition. So in other words, the more we engage them in managing their own learning process, in developing their thinking skills, and in learning to learn, the more also they start thinking about cognitive processes. And that, of course, improves or is actually metacognition. The next point is that if we manage to do that, so if we manage to develop their metacognitive strategies, this leads to better grades, to better academic performance. And this improvement of pupil outcomes, and this has clearly been shown. I will share with you a number of publications and books from the new science of learning at the end of the session, if anybody's interested in reading more about this. So this improvement in pupil outcomes is irrespective of the subject, and it's also irrespective of the student's age. So this is relevant this is relevant for children as well as teenagers and university students. And studies, various studies, have clearly shown a positive cycle. So when the teacher focuses on the development of thinking skills, this leads to greater motivation, improves metacognition, and that in turn increases our students' motivation. Um, and finally, I've mentioned this already, it's of benefit to students from primary age up to university. So let's start straight away with the first area that I would like to focus on, which is cognitive control functions. Now, cognitive control functions is another term. It's actually the term that I prefer when talking about an area of cognitive skills that in literature or in the literature on thinking skills is also called executive brain functions. So people use cognitive control functions or executive brain functions. So it's two terms for the same set of thinking skills. I use the term cognitive control functions rather than executive functions, because what I've noticed is when I talk to language teachers and educational managers from the area of ELT, there is often a confusion because the term executive is so heavily loaded with teaching business executives that many people initially associate the term executive brain functions with teaching, as I said, business executives. So I use the term cognitive control functions. I also think it's more transparent as a concept to call them cognitive control functions, really. So what are they? What are those cognitive control functions or executive skills, as Dawson and Guari actually call them? So this is from a pretty recent publication, 2018. It's part of the list that I'm going to share with you towards the end of this session. So they say executive skills allow us to organize our behavior over time and override immediate demands in favor of long-term goals. And that's very, very important, isn't it? Not to give in to immediate demands, but somehow keep longer-term goals in sight and work towards them. And children, of course, need to learn that. They do not have those skills initially. Through the use of these skills, we can plan and organize activities, sustain attention, and persist to complete tasks or complete the task. Executive skills enable us to manage our emotions and monitor our thoughts in order to work more efficiently and effectively. Simply stated, these skills help us regulate our behavior. And there's another short quotation that I'd like to share with you from the same book, which sheds light on what I've hinted at. Executive skills obviously are not developed at birth or for some time after that. We see their beginnings in the infant and toddler. So the areas that many of us, I guess, are very interested in, and even more of them in the 5-year-old, but even the 15-year-old, we sometimes marvel at the lack of planning, time management, or especially inhibition. And as a university teacher, I remember many times when I thought, well, even university students sometimes, especially at the beginning of their studies, have serious problems with some of those skills. For example, planning and time management. So what cognitive control functions are there? And this is where I would like to ask you to just take a look at this image here. So this is an image that I think might, we will see, serve as a metaphor for cognitive control function number one, so to speak. So what I would like to ask you Somebody saying neurons. So what do you think, looking at this image, what might be the first cognitive control function? Would you kindly use the chat box now, so not the Q&A box, the chat box now, to just type in 1 or 2 word answers here? Okay, so what do you think this image is a metaphor of in terms of the first cognitive control function? Connections, lovely. So obviously neuronal networks and neuronal connections we have here. And they have a very important function, of course, and that's connected to the first cognitive control function, networking orders. Confused, Guven says. Okay. So what might be joining ideas, channel their learning, joining dots, integration of information, reactions, neurons, connections, but also communication connections. Okay, we're getting closer, of course, and those neurons and their neuronal networks, these connections, they are actually connected with one extremely important skill. And that skill, and I will reveal it here, has to do, and that is cognitive control function number 1, our working memory. And the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University have defined it as the ability to hold information in mind and use it. So if you think about this for a moment, we are not talking long-term memory here. So we are not talking another very, very important cognitive skill, which is about, for example, remembering lists of words and irregular verb forms in our students' long-term memory. We're talking about the working memory, which has also been called the short-term memory. Could you maybe just type into the chat box when you think of your learners, when they need the working memory in language learning? Or maybe we'll I'm being a bit too fast here. Maybe we'll look at that a little bit later. Okay, so let's have a look at the second. Here's my question, actually. I thought it was going to come later. Okay, so let me repeat again. Please think of your learners' learning process, their language learning process, okay? So what language learning phases are there when a well-developed working memory is essential? So think of what you do with your learners and what you expect your learners to do, okay? When in your lessons is a well-developed working memory absolutely important? Okay, when you review something with them, right? HW, when they do their homework and you have explained the homework to them, when you introduce new vocabulary, okay, yeah, now we are talking. Absolutely, thank you. When they are supposed to follow your instructions, if and when they've already forgotten your instructions, they will not be able to follow them. When you want to help them remember something, yes. Self-assessment, understanding rubrics, absolutely. Imagine they're doing a test, but they don't understand the rubric. It's a long rubric, and they have forgotten, you know, what the rubric is all about. They will not be successful in the test. Recounting events, for example, when you tell them a story, when you tell a story, they need to remember the ongoing events in the story, and if they don't, they will not get the gist of the story. When you're practicing the language, absolutely. Practice, and in use, Katja. Thank you. Absolutely. When you introduce a bit of new language, and then you want to practice it, they need to have it in their working memory. Genre structures, Mark. I guess you are certainly right. This is also part of the short-term memory, but I guess also to a certain degree or to a large degree, it's got to do with their long-term memory also. Okay, thank you. But also, you know, in the skills areas, think about having a conversation with someone. Someone asks me a question, I want to give an answer. If I've forgotten what their question is, I cannot give an answer. Or reading, when I'm reading a longer sentences, if I forget what the first half of the sentence is all about, I will not understand the second half of the sentence. Same is true, of course, in writing. Students need to kind of like hold in their working memory what they have just written in order to be able to continue with their writing. Okay, so thank you so much. Let's have a look at the second cognitive control function. I hope this image is a good metaphor of the second cognitive control function. What do you think this second cognitive control function is all about? Self-regulation. Thank you so much. Absolutely. Yes. Any other ideas here? Recalling information, understanding. Okay. Emotional control, Mark. Thank you very much. Processing information, language, I guess. Okay. Thinking, yes. Yeah. I hope, you know, this image creates associations of somebody focusing their attention, thinking, so imagining maybe also, yes. So the second one, the second cognitive control function is actually about inhibitory control. That's what it's called. And inhibitory control is really the process of being able to focus our attention. It's the process of not giving in to any distractions, okay? And our learners, of course, have distractions all the time. I don't need to tell you. So we want them to focus their attention. We want them to be able to actually keep the goals, the long-term goals in mind also. When is inhibitory control important for your learners? Any suggestions here? When trying something new, lovely, thank you. When they need to express themselves clearly, absolutely. In the classroom, when introducing a new topic, doing individual tasks, listening activities, absolutely. Learning new concepts, Carolina, thank you. Yes. Okay, lovely. And then we have a comprehension, yes. We have a third one, and the third one, I found it a bit difficult to find a good metaphor, but maybe this is helpful and useful. Any idea what this might be a metaphor of what the third cognitive control function might be all about? Generating ideas, problem solving, definitely. Alcione, thank you. Logic, logical thinking, recalling long-term memory, producing what has just been learned, giving ideas and questions, processing information. Yes, mind mapping absolutely would be a good example. Yes. Analyzing and creating, producing outcomes, filtering information. Lovely, lovely. Thank you so much. So it's a little bit of all of the things that you have said, really. The third one is actually about cognitive flexibility. And cognitive flexibility, of course, in some ways includes the other two, because unless you have a good working memory, unless you're able to focus on your task, you will also not be able to think flexibly. So the definition is the ability to master thoughts and impulses so as to resist temptations, distractions, and habits, and to pause and think before acting. So important for children, isn't it? Can you think of your learner's learning process again? And can you just make a few suggestions about when cognitive flexibility is required in your classrooms with your learners? In input phases, okay, doing project work, goal setting, lovely, thank you, Mariana. Writing a sentence, clearly also writing more than a sentence, writing a paragraph, writing a text, assignments, step-by-step concept development, problem solving, definitely. Lovely. Using the target language when we want them to actually use the language as themselves. When there's a big decision-making time, yes, even when there's a small decision-making time. Transforming an affirmative to an interrogative, that's interesting, thank you. Anything else? Answering reading comprehension questions, okay, yes. Yeah, so there is actually a rather broad area of examples where students will actually need these cognitive skills. So here are the three cognitive control functions, or the core cognitive control functions: working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility. There is others, for example, time management. There are things like learning to plan, etc., etc., etc. But these are the core three. And what I would like to do for you now is I would like to, first of all, I don't forget this. I've written a white paper for Cambridge University Press on cognitive control functions in language learning. It's a white paper that refers to working with children, even pre-primary children, primary children, secondary children, and even young adults. I think it's a 24-page introduction to cognitive control functions that also offers quite a number of very concrete practical examples. So if you're interested in that, you can actually download it, and immediately it's something you can download for free. My colleagues have actually kindly put the link in the chat box. So when you click on this chat box, you can download this paper immediately. I'm going to share a few examples of original activities I have developed with you now. So the first one actually would be an activity that it's not an activity I have developed, okay? But it's a great activity to develop children's working memory, working memory, okay? It's called the N-back task. And this is what it's all about, okay? You present to your students a sequence of items. Could be letters, it could be images, it could be words, it could be multi-word items, it could be chunks of language, depending on the level of your students, of course. Then what you do is, so you present one item at a time. The students have to indicate, so whether the item they are shown is the same item they were shown n items ago. So when you say n minus 1, then they have to clap their hands, say, or snap their fingers when the item they see is the same item as the previous item. When n is -2, it needs to be the same item that they saw not last, but previously, okay? I'll do an example here. So an example would be, so you're showing blue, the next item you show is green, but of course they won't see blue anymore. So no reason for them to clap their hands. But if the next item they see is green, they have to remember that the previous item was green and they have to clap their hands, okay? So red, no reason to clap. Pink, no. But red, no. Red, yes, now they would clap their hands, okay? So let's actually do an activity. I'm expecting you will all be clapping your hands now enthusiastically in front of the screen. Okay, now let's just imagine, you know, this is what you do in your classroom. Here we go. This is the first word. Right. I can hear some of you clapping. Okay, now they should clap their hands. Yes, and now they should clap again. No reason to clap. Now they should clap their hands. Okay, so this is n-1, or this was n-1. So let's do one. Let's do an activity with 2 back, okay? So you clap your hands when the word you see is the same word you were shown 2 slides ago, okay? Here we go. Yes, absolutely. And now again, very well done. And now again. Okay. This is from a research study into the N-back task done by Steinberg. He says practicing the N-back task has been shown to improve working memory. They've tried this out both with primary students and teenagers. The training needs to be scaffolded. By this, I mean, Steinberg says that the activities should be demanding, but not so demanding that they overwhelm the learner's current abilities. Practicing it might involve repeating multiple item sequences of the same length until this number of items is mastered. So I have recently taught a group of primary students, actually for 4 years. I started teaching them 5 years ago. The little anecdote, if I may share it, is that I live in the middle of nowhere in the Austrian countryside, and my grandson, it was about 5.5 years ago, started going to the local primary school. Now, the local primary school is actually quite a good one, but it's not really well known for brilliance in teaching English as a second language. So I pulled a few strings and I asked the people in the ministry if they would allow me to teach that class for free 3 hours a week. The standard number of hours here in Austria is 1 hour a week, so less than most of you have. I asked for 3 hours a week, and I was given permission so I could do a kind of a classroom research project of 4 years, teaching, among other kids, my own grandson. This was fantastic. And I used many of the activities that I'm going to be talking about here. And it was quite fascinating how engaged the kids got with the N-back task. So I used to go up to when they were like, I think 7, I introduced the N-back task for the first time. So I did -1, -2. At the end of year 2, I did -3. And it was actually fascinating to see that children's working memory really got better. I even tried with the kids in their 4th year, I tried N-4, which some kids still managed to do, but not all of them. Okay, so what can we do now to actually integrate these principles into our teaching and challenge our learners cognitively as an ongoing teaching and learning principle? It's a pleasure for me now that I can also use examples from the 2nd edition of Superminds here. Okay. Doyle and Zakrajsek say that new insights into how the human brain learns make it clear that many of the learning practices used in the past and that students continue to use are highly inefficient, ineffective, or just plain wrong. Better learning does not always require more effort or more time. Rather, one needs only effectively align how the brain naturally learns with the demands of the classroom. So this leads us, I think, almost naturally to the question, how do we learn? How do students learn best? What would you consider evidence-based knowledge about your students' learning? And in this case, your evidence, it could be anecdotal evidence. How do your students learn best? Are you able to point towards any important principles maybe? Can I ask you to just type in one or two of the things by creating experiences for them? So if they are personally engaged and if the learning is experiential and not just input or transactional, not overwhelming them with too many pieces of information. Yes, engaging them in play. If the experiences are memorable, lovely, thank you, through games and songs. If, and I would like to stress this 100,000 times, if the activities are meaningful, playing when they're very young, by applying what they're learning. We learn new things through observation, by giving constructive by creating familiarity towards things, by giving constructive feedback, relevance, having fun, relatable learning experiences, anything that means something to me personal that I can relate to as a learner, I will also remember better. Regular recall, I cannot stress this often enough. Thank you, Mark. Ageliki, hands-on activities, yes. Senses-related learning, by getting students involved in the activities and activities that are fun activities. Okay, so let's just share what science says the 4 pillars of learning are. The first one, not surprisingly, is attention. And we mentioned previously this ability to focus, attention, and the ability to actually stick to a task, to focus on a task in spite of all possible kinds of distractions. The next point here, and several of you actually mentioned that, active engagement or curiosity, this experiential learning also that somebody mentioned, which encourages our brain to ceaselessly test new hypotheses, where students really want to get something out from the learning process, something we observe, with children when they're very young. Learning is not um, pain. Learning is something they are naturally interested in, and it's got to do with this natural curiosity. Absolutely. Then I think somebody mentioned error feedback. Somebody mentioned the importance of feedback, that children are actually learning, and we all learn from feedback. And last but not least, making what we are learning fully automated. I mean, when we think of the alphabetization process, the children initially learn letters, and then they learn to join them. And then, of course, after some time, this becomes a fully automatic process, and they don't need to think of individual graphemes or sounds anymore. They're able to look at a word and immediately know not only how to say the word, but also what it means. And gradually, of course, as avid readers, we are able to look not just only at one word, but at several words at a time, and deduce a meaning for that. And Mark actually stresses here the importance of various aspects of information, like words and images together. Or we could extend this and say sounds and images together. Also, of course, when it comes to the teaching of young learners, and multisensory activation, the activation, or getting them to move and see information and hear information at the same time. So a bit of food for thought here. Pay attention is interesting, isn't it? It's an interesting metaphor. We need to give something in order to get something. Steven Pinker says, in an optimally designed information retrieval system, an item should be recovered only when the relevance of the item outweighs the cost of retrieving it. And that is very much in line with what 2 or 3 people actually have typed in the chat box. And that is, if I can relate to something, if it's personally relevant to me, then it makes sense to retrieve items. The second one, engagement. Engagement is a wonderful thing, but engagement is not always something that is an equivalent to learning. So there are even potential downsides to engagement. And Carl Piaf says that just because they're busy doesn't mean they're learning anything. So it needs to be meaningful, as several of you have stressed. We need to engage them in meaningful learning activities. And this is something that the more and more I become interested in developing thinking skills, the more it is obvious. And this is why I'm talking about developing cognitive engagement through a process, an ongoing process of challenging our learners. Is so important for me. Learning happens when people have to think hard. That is probably the most important takeaway information from the recent science of learning. Let's go back to cognitive flexibility. This is a little activity that I developed. And it's a simple activity, but it's extremely powerful. Cognitive flexibility is about being on top of the learning process when the rules of the game change, so to speak, when a new activity is introduced, when a change to a routine is introduced, that's when we need cognitive flexibility the most. You all know Simon Says, okay? We play Simon Says with our class, and they know when I say Simon Says stand up, they have to stand up. But when I say sit down, without having said Simon Says, they're not allowed to sit down, okay? Now do that, play the game with them, and then challenge them, and clap your hands and say Jennifer says, or Tom says. And the learners know that now they must watch out for a different new command. Okay, so you say you continue playing Simon Says, and then all of a sudden you say Jennifer says, do this or that, and then you say again Simon Says, do this, do that. So they have to really focus their attention. It's great fun, and they are actually developing their cognitive flexibility. Okay, next one, inhibitory control training. That's also called mindfulness training these days. Creative visualization, we used to call it in the past. Many different things we can do. Ask them to close their eyes. Listen to all the sounds they can hear from outside the classroom. Ask them to become aware of all the sounds they can hear from inside the classroom. And now ask them to turn their attention to their own breathing and observe as they breathe in and breathe out, and so on and so forth. These mindfulness activities were very popular in the first edition of Superminds. We've kept them. In the second edition, we have developed new ones here. This would be one from Students Book 1. So I'm not playing the audio here. The audio would be about, so it's about imagining the perfect Sunday, okay? So close your eyes and listen. Imagine your perfect Sunday. You're in bed, sleeping, but it isn't much fun. You get out of bed, but what do? Do you play football with friends? Do you ride your bike or ride your horse? Do you play a board game or watch TV? Do you go skiing or go surfing? There are lots of things you can do. Now open your eyes and draw a picture. Okay, so this is what we asked them to do. Obviously, this is a revision of language. So some people have stressed that these kind of inhibitory control developing activities can also be used for revision. And this would be a way of actually doing that. And we can, depending on the level of the learners, we can get them to draw a picture, we can get them to talk about their experience, and later to write about those experiences. I'd like to share an activity here which is all about cognitive flexibility. So it's a fun activity first. It's a song. It's a song from the second edition of Superminds. I'll play you the video in a moment. You will see that the songs are all new, and they've got lovely animations also. But very often we have a thinking task following the actual listening here. You can see that the text is about a magic tree, and then in number two, this little icon here, that is a task that reminds you about development of cognitive skills. So look, think, and write. And what they're supposed to be doing here, this is a critical thinking task, actually, a so-called Venn diagram. Here they're supposed to write the food that grows on the magic tree from the song. Here they're supposed to write all the words they know about things that grow on real trees. And in here, in this overlapping area, they write things that grow on both the magic, but also on real trees. Okay, so here we go. Let's listen to the song.
1, 2, 3, 4. I've got a magic tree with lots of things to eat. I've got a magic tree, let's go and get a treat. Pick an ice cream from the tree. Pick an orange from the tree. Pick an apple from the tree. It's there for you and me. I've got a magic tree with lots of things to take. I've got a magic tree, let's go and get a cake. Pick an ice cream from the tree. Pick an orange from the tree. Pick an apple from the tree. It's there for you and me. I've got a magic tree.
Okay, and so on and so forth. Let me go to the next.
1, 2,
No.
3, 4.
To the next slide. I hope you like the song, and I hope you can see that they are getting involved now in this critical thinking activity. Okay, just a few more examples. This is also about cognitive flexibility. They're learning about different time zones. They're reading text. This is from the activity book. The activity books are now in full color. They read about different time zones. So what's the time in Brazil, in Turkey, and in China? And they listen and they write the names of the countries on the lines here before they actually read the next activity, which, as you can see, is also labeled with the cognitive development icon here. Stands for Cambridge Life Competencies, and they have to read and write the times. So it's 7 o'clock in Brazil. What's the time in Turkey? And what's the time in China? Of course, based on what they have written, what they've read up there. What are life competencies? I've mentioned it here. This is another white paper that I would like to invite you to download. And again, my colleagues from Cambridge will, I'm sure in a minute, put in the link in the chat box here. So thank you, that's good. What are those life skills? So creative thinking, and I'm not going to define this now. It's obvious, isn't it? Critical thinking, learning to learn, the very core of the development of cognitive skills, communication, collaboration, of course, social responsibilities, and emotional development. And what we do, we are using this life skills grid also. We used it when we developed the second edition of Superminds. And you will find a whole range of activities, not only developing cognitive control functions, but also developing creative thinking, create life skill competencies with your learners. And the teacher's book gives you very, very clear sort of support each time. So you know exactly which of the life competencies you're practicing here. This would be an example of developing, developing students' creativity, looking at different houses and homes, doing a little activity here where they look at these activities, decide which is on water, which is round, which has got stairs in it, then look at the picture, answer these questions here, and then design, for example, a tree house or some other house. So this is about creative thinking. Here an example for developing social responsibility. Here a text. This is from Supermind 2nd edition workbook 3. Text on Helen Keller. It's about emotional development. Okay, so Mark, I think this is the answer to your question. The white paper that you can download gives you a number of bibliographical recommendations, and you can see a few here also on this page. Okay, so thank you so much for joining in. This is where I will stop sharing my presentation, and we will have Oliver joining us again.
Hello, yes, again, hello again. Well, thank you so much, Herbert, for that interesting and practical session. I just wanted to mention, if you like the materials and if you want to know more about Supermind 2nd edition, you can see more at cambridge.org/superminds2, and I think it's in the chat as well. Let's look at some questions. We've got just a few minutes left till we reach the top of the hour. Herbert, you've already answered Mark's question, I think, with the bibliography that you had there at the end of the slideshow.
Yeah.
And just to remind people that while we won't be sharing the slides, you will be able to rewatch the webinar on YouTube from next week. Okay, so if you want to see that bibliography in more detail, you'll be able to check it out on YouTube. So yes, time for a couple more questions before we reach the end. Herbert, we have one here. So my students tend to forget so fast. How can I make sure they remember important language from stories?
Yes, a very important question. I mean, it is, children learn relatively quickly, but they forget quickly too. So it's a key point. Well, a few tips here. Revisit texts, not only texts, also activities regularly. So when a text or a story, you know, when it has been done for the first time, it should never be seen as done and dusted, actually. So summarize learning regularly. What I do is at the beginning and sometimes also last few minutes of a lesson, I often use a think, pair, and share process. That doesn't take longer than 2 or 3 minutes. So I would say, for example, okay, remember last lesson. Now think of all the new words we learned in the last lesson. Remember them, write them down, then pair, get together with a partner, exchange your findings, and then share them with the whole class. That is usually a great warm-up activity. It gets them to think straight away. And then the third point, that would obviously be a different webinar, but practice testing. The new science of learning has shown that practice testing is actually the most powerful revision activities. You know, many students, when you tell them to learn something, for example, for a test, say you have a group of 10-year-olds, you ask them to learn something for a test, they engage in rereading, you know, reading the same kind of like word lists or stories or what have you again and again and again. And research has shown that is what is a lot more powerful than rereading or highlighting or underlining is practice testing. So if you can, give your students practice tests, or self-testing is another example.
Okay, great. Thank you, Herbert. And I think we've got time for one more question. This is, when you presented the song, you mentioned the importance of multisensory learning on memory. And so how does this sit in relation to, recent claims that the learning styles theory is obsolete?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the learning styles theory has been debunked, as some people say. The research is crystal clear. Sorry, there is actually no justification for the learning styles theory in the sense of students learning only when information is presented in their quote unquote channel. So it doesn't make sense to sort of somehow find out who are the visual learners and then present information to them only visually, and do the same with you know, the auditory or kinesthetic learners only. But, and this is important, this does not mean that there isn't very, very clear evidence from neurobiology that the activation of more than one of the senses simultaneously, the simultaneous activation of more than one senses is not important for memory. That's absolutely clear. And several of you have stressed this, you know, showing them, as Mark said, I remember showing them a picture and the written word, or showing letting them hear language and at the same time make sure they make a movement, etc., etc. That is something. So this combination of senses, that is very important.
That's great. Thank you so much for that answer. Well, I think that really is all we've got time for today. So thank you so much, Herbert, for that fascinating presentation. And of course, to all of you who've joined us today from all over the world. So this was the last in our series of Superminds events. If you weren't able to see any of the other webinars, please just go to the World of Better Learning website and you'll be able to rewatch them there. And as we've said before, you'll be able to rewatch this as well next week on YouTube. So it just remains for me to say thank you again. I hope you can join us for more sessions in the future. And don't forget to look out for your email next week where you can download your certificate and which will also contain the links to the recordings. So thank you, Herbert, and thanks to all of you.
Same from me. Thank you so much, Oliver, and our colleagues in Cambridge for supporting us. And thanks everybody for joining us, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Brilliant. Thank you.